Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Light the World podcast. I'm your host, LT World. If you're new to this podcast, what we do on this channel is we look at culturally relevant topics such as religion and politics, philosophies and ideologies. We take a look at it all, and we try to analyze them historically. What's their background? How did they come to be? And we also analyze them from both perspectives. What does the left say about this topic? What does the right say about this topic? What is this person? What is that person? And we try to understand different arguments and see which ones make the most sense and just try to break it all down. If that sounds interesting to you, definitely subscribe or follow along whatever podcast platform you're listening on. And you can also check me out on Instagram, Twitter, and you'll see my stuff at ltworld.info. So, yeah. And also, for you people who are on YouTube, which, again, should check out my YouTube channel, you will see that I have a different setup right now. This is my new podcast studio, if you will. Added a little more pizzazz to the top of the shelves. I'm going to be adding some things to the walls, maybe. I'm going to be doing a little bit more to it. But as of now, this is the setup. I'm excited. I'm really happy to be here. But as I'm moving in the moving process, things are changing. I'm a little busy. So that being said, the next few weeks, I might not be uploading any new podcast episodes. I might be putting in some trailers for the next season, which I'm excited to release. The next season is all about God, atheism versus theism, and kind of looking at the history of those, and also looking at the arguments, cosmological, moral, like all these different arguments. So I'm preparing for that season. I'm trying to compile a bunch of episodes together, make them higher quality, and then schedule them out. So I'm going to take the next few weeks to focus on that. So if you don't see any uploads, that's why, but I plan on releasing some trailers, maybe some YouTube exclusives to give you a taste of what they're like, and also maybe just some commentary stuff or giving you some updates on what's happening. It's really simple stuff, but so there might not be a consistent posting for the next few weeks as I'm preparing for the next season, but don't worry, I will be coming back and better than ever. And also, since this room, I haven't added any foam or added any sound acoustic stuff to this room yet. I plan to, so if the audio sounds a little echoey or sounds a little bit like the way it is, that's why. Again, I'm moving, so I'm going to adjust everything. I'll add stuff to help reduce these issues. I'll try my best to make the audio sound great in post-edit, but be aware that what might be why the audio sounds the way it does. But all that being said, I'm excited. I'm excited for the next season. I'm really delving into the topic. I'm really getting ready. I've been having a lot of fun with it, so hopefully you guys will enjoy it as well. And now's a great time to subscribe and follow along if you haven't already. Anyway, enough of that said. Let's jump into today's topic. Today, we're going to be talking about the Republicans' platform. Yes, what do the Republicans believe? So last episode, we talked about what the Democrats believe. That went on for a pretty long time. That was like 50 minutes long episode. I'm going to try to keep this one more succinct. I'm going to try to cover a similar amount of ground, but try to keep it more succinct and all that. So if I don't, well, it is what it is. But anyway, so we're going to be talking about today the Republican platform, because nothing brings people together like politics. Similarly, like I did with the Democrat episode, I took the Republican webpage, looked at their kind of like their statement of beliefs or statement of platform. I'll link it below. So yeah, just from a aesthetic point of view, I prefer the Democrat page because it was a lot easier to navigate. They both have paragraphs full of information, way a lot to read, but from a aesthetic point of view, I like the Democrat webpage better, but that doesn't really matter. So let's jump into it. So first, let's start off with the economy. So it could be almost wrapped up to say that the Republicans, within their whole statement of beliefs, pretty much were all about limited government involvement in the economy. They liked open markets. They believed that if government got too heavily involved, that actually slows things down. So they opposed a lot of highly government intervention. Which the thing to want to consider is, so what is more important, economic growth or making sure of production standards? So, for instance, a lot of times government will get involved to help make sure that people are following ethical codes, make sure food industries are producing food that's better quality, so forth and so on. So when we talk about government intervention, something to consider is, are we willing to sacrifice maybe some economical growth for the sake of ethical duties or something like that, or government oversight for the sake of protecting consumers? So that's just something to consider when we talk about some of these things that they propose, that they think the government should get out of. But anyway, let's just jump into some of their statements here. They had a statement here saying American businesses now face the world's highest corporate tax rates. That's like putting lead shoes on your cross-country team. It reduces the company's ability to compete overseas and encourages them to move abroad. So they proposed that that government should lower the taxes on big corporations. So a lot of times you'll hear from the left or politicians say that the rich need to pay their fair share, something along those lines. So something to ask is, okay, if the Republicans want to lower the amount of taxes on corporations, something to consider is the government actually able to allocate the money that they would tax more effectively than the big corporations would for economic growth? Can we trust big corporations to actually use their wealth in a way that will stimulate the economy so that everyone benefits, not just the big corporations? And that's normally the idea, that the government can actually better allocate the funds than big corporations is. Something to consider is, has that happened? Is the government actually really good at allocating funds? Something to look into from a historical perspective. So they talked a lot about lowering tax rates on corporations and on people in general. There's a lot about cutting taxes as much as possible for the sake of growth. They were a big proponent for international trade, which international trade is crucial for all sectors of America's economy. Massive trade deficits are not... International trade is crucial for all sectors of American economy. Massive trade deficits are not. So they were a big proponent for American exports, American producing goods to export across the nations, export across the world. And obviously through international trade, you can make more money. You can also lower costs of things if you get goods from across the nations. Something to always ask yourself, though, is, are we too reliant on other nations? Is your economy strictly based on exports? Are you making more of your money off exports as a country? If so, if other countries start to fail, are you dependent on them? Or are you getting all your goods, for instance, for like China, you're getting all your goods from China, so you're dependent on them, that they wield big political power over you? So those are some things to consider, is, are we dependent on other nations? Because the more dependent you become on other nations, the more political power you lose, the more economic strength you lose, and in the cases of crisis for other countries, you will fall too, because you are dependent on these nations. So you may not grow as fast if you don't engage in certain types of international trade, but at the same time, you may be more secure in cases of crisis because you have more of a community to help each other. So some things to consider. They also wanted to have a comprehensive review of federal regulations on businesses, on homes, on all these things. But they also said, especially those dealing with the environment. So Democrats are a big proponent for environmental policies, especially on businesses. But according to the Republican webpage, they were a pretty big proponent for cutting back on environmental policies that don't help the environment, quote unquote, according to them, and only stop the growth of business. And they think that the economic success of a nation will ultimately be able to curb any sort of environmental catastrophe down the road. I think we kind of talked about this on the Democrat one, but again, it's something to ask, is the environment actually degrading that fast that it's a big concern? Is global warming, global change that big of a concern that we need to focus on it immediately? And if it is a big concern, then we should do something about it. Now, in theory, this idea that, well, wealth will eventually be able to help us overcome any sort of disasters down the road environmentally is assuming we can accumulate enough wealth and have enough innovation by that point when things are too crap because the environment sucks, and we have actually enough resources to overcome that. Because if the environment decelerates and is collapsing faster than we can make wealth and make innovation, that's a problem. We won't be able to keep up. So you must assume that we will be able to. So something to consider is the environment degrading faster than we're able to innovate? So if it is, we need to slow down that down at the expense of some economic policy. We need to be able to slow down environmental decay. So it's just considering what is moving faster and what is actually more important timeline-wise. In regards to homes, they were about also revising Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are basically like home loan government structures. To it's starting to slip from my mind exactly how they work. I think they have a lot to do with either helping people with lower incomes get a home or something, or people who aren't able to pay off their home loans, they consume them, or help them in the process. I forget how it works. I just know it's a government run program for housing. Forget the details about it though. They also talked a lot about, from an economic standpoint, they talked a lot about the budget, about balancing the budget, and imposing cap limit spending to appropriate historical, so forth and so on. So they basically, the big Republican thing was always keeping the balanced budget, and lowering the debt we're in, making sure that we are making sure that we're paying off our national debt, getting that as low as possible, balancing the budget, and putting caps on spending. Again, this will go back to the whole idea that they want limited government involvement in economics, and they also want the government to basically not spend nearly as much money as it does. So, big proponent for that. And again, something to consider is debt always a bad thing? Are we able to get enough debt that we can pay off and that help actually stimulate growth? Are we able to get into debt that will actually stimulate more growth? So is debt always a bad thing? Something to think about. But they're a big part about balancing the budget and paying off the deficit. They also wanted to protect intellectual property, but I mean the Democrat side also wanted to protect intellectual property. They want more property rights. They want more small businesses and entrepreneurship. So they talked a lot about actually reducing occupational licensing laws, and also making it easier for business starters to start businesses. So entrepreneurs to start businesses I don't think the camera's focusing properly. But so yeah, they talked a lot about helping small business owners and small business startups to get started by basically lowering government regulation. So a big part actually of government regulation is to help control the economy to a certain extent. So take for instance, when if the government wants to slow down the economy, they'll put more regulations in place to make it harder for businesses to excel or to make more money because they want to slow down economic growth. So they'll put regulations in the way, and they'll raise interest rates and all these different things to help slow down the economy. So a big part of government regulation is to do that. But in a lot of cases, sometimes these government regulations get put up because of emergencies or whatever, but they never get taken down. And so therefore they keep stunning growth, even though they serve no longer a practical purpose for the economy, or they no longer serve a very practical purpose. So sometimes it's important just to evaluate what government regulations are good and bad, and how that can impact small businesses, how they can impact big businesses, how that can impact everyday people. So it's just something to think about. The Republican Party want to advance legislation that brings transparency and accountability to the Federal Reserve, Federal Open Market Committee, and so they wanted to have more transparency. So the minimum wage is something that they want to be handled at the state level. And so they say that minimum wage is an issue that should be handled by state and local level. Whenever you task things to states, you always have to ask the question, is the federal government, normally the reason why federal government is pulled into things is because the federal government has more resources. It has more resources to use, and therefore it can be more effective than certain states that may not have the resources to handle certain issues. Is minimum wage one of those issues that's better handled by the federal state? Maybe, probably not, because a lot of times states understand their people better than big governments do, because they have to make policies that are so broad and overreaching to fit in a whole 360 million people, while states only have to make policies that fit within a few million people, or a few 100,000 people, and so they can be a little bit more detailed in their policies. So a lot of times with stuff like minimum wage, the state level is more effective, but it is something to consider, is do all states have the resources to make certain policies effective? So that was pretty much the economy side of things. They talked a lot about the Constitution. So it was interesting because the Democrat page did talk about the Constitution. It's not like they didn't talk about the Constitution at all. But the Republican page really heavily hit home about how the Constitution is important, how we as a nation need to follow the Constitution. So heavy emphasis on defending the Constitution, which a question to ask is, just because it's a historical document, just because it's the founding of the nation, does that make it law? Does that mean that it should actually govern what we say and do? Who is to say that we haven't advanced to the point as a morally or advanced intellectually, that we can actually create a better system than the Constitution put in place and actually revise the Constitution in a way that it pretty much changes the whole foundations, the whole fundamentals. So is the Constitution actually robust? Is it something that we should actually defend? And that's something to think about from a social standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a political standpoint. Is the Constitution still valid to this day? Or should we think about revising it and actually reconsidering it? They also talk a lot about separation of power, limited government. We kind of already talked about that a little bit already. They talked about the merit and hard work should determine the advancement in our society. Get rid of unfair preferences, quotas, set aside forms of discrimination. So they talked a lot about how everyone should be equal, and this includes things like schools giving certain preferences or quotas for certain races and stuff like that. We'll get a little bit more into that with education. But they talk a lot about just everyone being equal. They want the Constitution to be interpreted as it originally was meant to be interpreted as at the time when it was written. So they talked a lot about how we should interpret the Constitution in a way that the writers would have intended it to be interpreted at the time. Which again just kind of begs the question of, is that actually still effective for us today? Or should we evolve? Is that still relevant to today if something's written several hundred years ago? So something to think about. They encourage checks and balances for each branch of the government, the three branches, to watch over themselves. Watch over each other and use the power of checks and balances. They also talked a lot, now this shouldn't be any shocker that the Republican Party did this, but they talked a lot about religious freedom, defending religious rights. So this one included traditional marriage. They defended the idea that marriage should be recognized as a man marrying a woman, and they should be recognized as monogamy. So a monogamous marriage or monogamous lifetime relationship, whatever, with a man and a woman. And they really heavily emphasized that. They really heavily emphasized the traditional family model, defending the traditional family model of... They defended a lot of traditional marriage. They defended the traditional family model, basically this idea of husband and wife, and raising their children together. And they say this is the foundation for a healthy, robust society. So something to think about is, one, is this imposing religious beliefs onto a nation that is supposedly supposed to have a freedom of religion? So is this overstepping bounds that shouldn't be overstepped? One, to impose this idea that we need to support these traditional family values. Secondly, is it actually, statistically speaking, true that kids are better raised with two heterosexual parents who are bound in marriage? Is it actually true that they grow up to be healthier, happier people? Or is this unsubstantiated when they say that this is actually a healthy foundation for a free society, as they kind of put it? So some things to consider are those things. They also support a lot about how the Constitution defends religion. They want to promote religious freedom and speech and protect religious institutions, protect tax-exempt statuses for churches, which, again, the question can be asked is, are these religious institutions actually adding benefit to society that they've earned a tax exemption? Does this actually promote better social values within a community? Or can these tax exemptions actually be damaging because they're promoting certain values that we shouldn't be promoting, or promoting religions that we shouldn't be promoting at all? A case of this is the Scientology Church, where some people have criticized the fact that they get tax exemptions, even though they have been known to abuse some of their people and are kind of known as a cult to a certain extent. So is this a problem? Is this something that we need to change about how we, or at least analyze religions? And then when you start doing that, what are you saying about the whole idea of freedom of religion? You're defending some religions but not others? That seems kind of hypocritical when it comes to a nation bound to the freedom of religion. So there can be this issue of, are we giving tax exemptions to religions that are actually detrimental to society? One. And if we start picking and choosing religions, does that mean that now we no longer have the freedom of religion? So where are we going to land on this issue? Some food for thought. We also, they said, we strongly support the freedom of Americans to act in accordance with their religious beliefs, the right to people to conduct their businesses in accordance with their religious beliefs. So this kind of goes back to like a few years ago. You had the case of, what was that place called? Oh man, Hobby Lobby versus like Obamacare, basically, where Obamacare said that businesses of a certain size had to help pay for or give give healthcare programs that's included like Plan B pills that Hobby Lobby owners didn't want to do because they didn't support Plan B pills. They thought Plan B pills was killing a fetus, therefore murder, like, according to their religious views. And then they fought it in court and they ended up winning. So this is the whole idea of businesses should be able to practice their religions through their businesses, which again, this can turn into discrimination. And would we be supporting discrimination by doing this in a free society? Maybe. Depends on the religion. But it goes back to the whole dilemma of what religions are we picking and choosing here. They support the public display of Ten Commandments, which honestly could be argued as a promotion of a certain religion. So then they also talked a lot about the Second Amendment, which again shouldn't be a shocker, considering that the Republican Party is well known for trying to defend gun rights, and they are supported by the NRA and all that stuff. They talked a lot about upholding the rights of individuals to bear arms. They wanted people to be able to carry, conceal carry, and they oppose ill-conceived laws that would restrict magazine capacity or ban the sale of most popular and common modern rifles. I mean, California is well known for having extensive gun laws to the point where it's pretty much impractical for you to own a gun at all. So basically that just boils down to them wanting to defend gun rights. Something to ask then from that standpoint is the defense of gun rights, do you have greater benefit than costs from gun rights? Are more people killed and hurt due to the fact that people are able to bear arms? And does that cause more damage to society versus a society like some European countries, for instance, where guns aren't allowed, people don't own guns in general, and therefore, which society tends to have less violence? Which society tends to have less murder? Which society tends to have a better, friendlier populace, maybe? And how much can that be correlated to the fact that these gun laws are different? I know, for instance, in a lot of these European countries, they do tend to have obviously less shootings, less mass shootings, less gun violence, because they're not average citizen isn't able to get a hold of a gun, and it's pretty hard to get a hold of it on the black market because they crack down on it pretty hard. But a lot of times in these European countries, then they have increased other crimes, so they have increased stabbings, increased bludgeonings, increased these things and that. So a lot of times it's just trade-offs for one for the other in many cases. But still, it's important to analyze these things and to see which one does it actually make sense to defend the right to bear arms, or is it impractical? Would actually, a lot of times people also argue, from the right at least, that having the right to bear arms will protect you from the government, but is the government at a point where the weapons that they can use is more powerful than a rifle, so it's kind of impractical anyway? It doesn't really make sense to use that as a point of defense against the government. Who knows? They also wanted to call for strict limitations on U.S. aerial surveillance on society, and they wanted to only use surveillance primarily for border reasons and limit surveillance on citizens, mainly because they want to defend the privacy of the citizens. From a health, now we get into a little bit of the health side of things. They also were big proponents of pro-life, which shouldn't be a surprise again. So here's a statement from them. Accordingly, we assert the sanctity of human life and affirm that an unborn child has a fundamental right to life which cannot be infringed. We support human life amendment to the Constitution and legislation to make clear that the 14th Amendment protections apply to children before birth. So, one, I wasn't aware that the Republicans were, at least some of them, were hoping to create an amendment that defended the right to life, which I think is interesting. They also obviously are against pro-choice, then against abortion, and want Roe v. Wade be overturned, which is an interesting topic right now because it is being debated whether or not it will be overturned. So to learn more about that topic, again, you can go to my Abortion Explained video and podcast episode where I delve into that topic pretty in depth. So I won't go into too much about it here, but they are pro-life on the Republican platform. They were big proponents for property rights, but we already kind of talked about that a little bit earlier with the economy. They want less federal government, more state-run stuff, which goes back to the whole federalism thing. They want also so this is a voting topic. When they were big proponents for voter ID, because they believe that people will fraudulently vote in a way that is for other people or misconstrue the votes because there's not any ID. There might be non-citizens voting, so forth and so on, which is it may be true. I don't know statistically speaking how common it is for people to actually abuse the voting system. It's something I haven't looked too in depth to, but that's something to think about. And again, this whole episode is just me kind of going through their platform, explaining what they believe, so you're more informed and what they'll be fighting for, what Republicans believe in general. And just to understand, I'm not going into too much depth for the arguments. I'm just kind of giving a brief overview. They're also big proponents for protecting agricultural and wildlife. They believe that there should be more conservations for wildlife and more conservations for farming, which is actually pretty well in line with Democrats as well. They were big proponents for maintaining wildlife and agriculture, so that's not really anything too different from each other. As far as energy goes, they think Congress should give authority to state regulators to manage energy resources. So if a state is primarily a cool state, just let them keep doing their thing. If a state is primarily a green state, let them keep doing their thing. They think states should be able to control what type of power they produce, and there shouldn't be too much federal oversight when it comes to energy. They also think that there's too much government involvement, so they say the Democratic Party energy policies can be summed up in a slogan currently popular among its activists: keep it in the ground. Keeping energy in the earth will keep jobs out of reach of those who need them most. So they're against limiting oil and coal. They think people should be able to produce that. And they also support electric energy and all that, and like solar and all that stuff. They think that's a good thing, but they believe that there shouldn't be regulations then on gas and oil and coal. They think those are going beyond, and they think that'll hurt the economy. Which again, I've asked this in the last episode. Are the benefits, and I asked this earlier, are the benefits of saving the environment worth the cost of the economy, or is it not? There's something to just look into a little bit. They were also big proponents for nuclear energy, which I'm not sure where the Democratic Party stood on that. As far as the environment goes, speaking of which, they wanted there to be no carbon dioxide tax because there has been proponents of carbon dioxide tax proposed. Again, this kind of just goes back to the overarching question about the environment and the economy. And they talked a lot about just basically, to sum it up, a lot of these things was for the environment. Let states decide. Let states determine what's important to them, and then go from there. So they also talked a lot about Medicare and Social Security. They were big proponents of basically modernizing these things. So they weren't about getting rid of them. Yeah. So they wanted to reform. They wanted to reform the Social Security system, and they intended to modernize the Medicare system. So basically, they just want to reform it. And what does reform mean exactly? And that's kind of the big question. When I read through this thing, one of my biggest issues with the Republican one, especially, is that they didn't go into too much detail for certain things, and this is one of them. They just talked about reforming it, and when I read over it, it was basically like lower taxes. And move more of the Medicare funding and Social Security funding to the private market, which is very, very interesting because if you move it more into being funded by the private market, I'm just not sure how that would look. Honestly, I just don't understand how that would look, and I'm not sure exactly what they had in mind when they said it, when they proposed it. But I would just be interested in seeing if this would actually come up, like reforming it so that it's more privately funded. It's a government program, but it's funded primarily by private markets. I'm just curious what that would look like. And so it's just to ask the question, is that a more effective system? Oh, thunder. They also talked a lot about immigration. So they believe that the country should be providing asylum for people, but they believe that people should be checked to make sure they're not terrorists. They also think that the people who are born here, this is our party is a natural home for those who come in search for freedom and justice. We welcome all to the Great Opportunity Party. We're grateful to legal immigrants. They love legal immigration, but they demand tough penalties against those who engage in identity theft, fraudulent documents, traffic humans, and who, in general, are breaking the law. They're against illegal immigration. They believe there should be a giant wall across the border, which just a criticism on the wall. A lot of the drug trade issues don't have anything to do with the wall. Like, most of your drug traders are going through tunnels underground. They're shipping in through the seas or through rivers, and they're finding ways to sneak it on, even if they're going through legally. The wall's not really going to fix the drug issue. It might be able to keep out illegal immigrants to a certain extent, but it's not really going to help with the drug issue as far as that goes. And it might be a deterrent. Maybe it would, but I don't know if, economically speaking, it's going to be an effective way to actually stop illegal immigration. I don't know. But they're a big proponent for the wall. And they're a big proponent for heavy consequences. They're more about consequences for illegal immigration than the Democrats are. Is it fair? Should we actually be looking for ways to help illegal immigrants, because maybe make it easier for them to become legal immigrants? Or should we be finding programs to help bring them in, assimilate them among society because they're trying to escape a worse country or get a better economic situation? Maybe they're too poor to go through the system legally. Is it right for us to punish them? Is it right for us to push them away when they're in need? That's a humanitarian question. But they also support just stiff penalties for people who are breaking the law, which I don't think both sides pretty much agree on that. When it came to human trafficking, drug trade, they agree that people who are engaging in the sale of those things should be heavily punished. Whether or not these like drug users, they might differ a little bit. There are big proponents for national defense. The Republican page was all about basically raising funding to the national defense and also adding a audit to it to make sure that the funds are being used properly. So, is national defense that big of a concern? Or would it be better spent on other things? And that's just looking at the national budget, how much of it's going to national defense, and what's the return on that? Because a lot of times, funding to the national defense just basically means you're going to get a lot more, you're going to get more airplanes, you're going to get more tanks, a lot of times this money just gets pushed into things that we already have and just making more of them. And sometimes we don't even have the men or the specialists to operate all the machines, and a lot of times they'll just sit around and not be used. And they're really only, and a lot of these things are only used, a lot of these things that we'd be investing in are only used in cases of war, and even then, some of them aren't even effective or useful, depending where the war's taking place. So national defense, is it actually worth the investment, or the increased investment, I should say, or would the return just be marginal and not worth our time? So you also have they wanted to help Native Americans out, which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize this was a big part of the Republican platform. I learned something new. This was a big part of their platform, was helping the Native Americans out and sticking to a lot of their terms and helping them grow as a people, which also the Democratic Party wasn't really opposed to that either. They're about helping the Native Americans as well, so that's not really a differing topic. They were actually about, they supported Puerto Rico becoming, so the Democrats supported D.C. becoming a state. I don't know if they support Puerto Rico becoming a state. I didn't read it anywhere. But the Republican page, they were against D.C. becoming a state, but they supported Puerto Rico becoming a state. So they support the right of the United States citizens for Puerto Rico to become a state, fully become part of the Union. But for the statehood for the district can be advanced only by a constitutional amendment, and any other approach would be invalid. A statehood amendment was soundly rejected by the state when last proposed in 1976 and should not be revived. So I'm not entirely sure reason why DC they don't think this should be a state if people want to make it a state. I'm not sure why. I know Puerto Rico a few years ago had a vote to become a state, and there was like 53% said yes or something like that. We want to become a state, but nothing ever happened of it. So I can see why maybe Puerto Rico, but I don't understand why they're opposed against DC. I just think that's interesting. I just think it's interesting. They want less red tape for businesses, but we already talked about that. Education, they want parents to be the primary educators. So this kind of goes back to this whole idea with the whole thing going in Florida, with the Don't Say Gay bill, quote unquote. And you have this going on with I think it was Alabama, or I forget where it was, where basically the governor won because he said, I'm going to get rid of critical race theory in the schools. And people are like, yes, because parents didn't want critical race theory to be in their schools. And that really overturned an election. So the question to be asked is, parents aren't scholars in a lot of areas. And so should parents be the primary educators of a home? Since if I, as a parent, I'm not well educated in every topic. Even if I have a degree, I might not be well educated in a lot of topics. So do I actually have the ultimate authority when it comes to education? Should I have the ultimate authority when it comes to education? Maybe from an ethical standpoint, from a moral standpoint, how parents should have the right to raise their kids however they want, from a religious standpoint. But when it comes to education as a whole, is that realistic that parents have the ultimate authority? They also don't like, the Republican also didn't like Common Core. They didn't like Common Core assessments. They believe that states, again, going back to states, should control most of the educational standards, which would just be interesting because then it would be, let's just say I was raised in Tennessee and I got education there, but since the standards in Tennessee are different than the standards in California, it's much more difficult, or I can't get a job in California. Likewise, I can't get a job in Alabama because the education standards there are different. That's the issue you'd run into. The issue you'd run into is jobs and allocation of jobs and what certain states accept, what certain states don't accept, and what they demand and what they don't demand. And that's the issue that you would run into is getting rid of Common Core at a national level worth the hassle that could arise from all these states having different standards down the road, at least? I don't know. They want to implement religions back into school, so basically they want primarily Christianity, but in general they wanted students to be more taught about religion in schools, which actually I think is great for, if you would introduce it in a way that you would just give a general overview of all religions and try to just basically, here's what these religions believe, this is what they say, this is how they support them. I think that's actually a great idea. It would really increase cultural understandings from all different perspectives. But does that make sense to make students learn about it? Is that enough of an incentive to make students learn about religion in schools again? And when they say bringing religions back into school, to what extent does that mean? Also, does this also mean that they do say that like teachers should be able to pray and stuff like that? So to what extent then do we implement religion back into school? And does this get rid of the freedom of religion if teachers are able to practice a religion in a more free way? They wanted to add tax credits and vouchers to help make education affordable, and so forth and so on. In general, they also, for healthcare, something I forgot to mention. For healthcare, they wanted to get rid of Obamacare, which was no one really. I think they revised it over the past few years, but I don't think they really got rid of it fully. I don't think they are going to get rid of it anytime soon. But when this was written up, they wanted to get rid of Obamacare. They wanted to return back to the states their right to manage health insurance, manage insurance in general. But that goes back to the whole Federalist issue. Then they also talked about criminal justice system. They believe that the statement here was that over-criminalization, over-federalization in the first case, Congress and federal agencies have increased the number of criminal offenses in the U.S. Code from 3,000 in the early 1980s to more than 4,500 today. So they think a big part of the incarceration rate and stuff like that is that there's just a lot of laws that are being imposed that are unnecessary. So a big part of the platform was just lowering the amount of laws that there are, decreasing the amount of national laws at a federal level. Which are all these laws necessary? I think it's fair to say that they should be reviewed. But if they all are necessary, then you can't get rid of any of them. But if some of them, a lot of them aren't important or aren't necessary or are out of date, yeah, get rid of them. That's just kind of the idea. It's just kind of checking to see what laws do you get rid of, what laws do you keep. They supported mandatory minimums, which you would remember from the last episode that Democrats did not like the ideas of mandatory minimum sentencing because it just goes back to does mandatory minimums actually deter crime? If they do, they should be kept. If they don't, they shouldn't. More reform programs, especially religious ones. So more programs to help criminals get out, become functioning members of society. The Constitution. They supported the death penalty, and they think They think states should enact the death penalty as capital punishment. They think it should be an effective means. But that comes back to the humanitarian standpoint. Is that humane to do? And then that's a moral debate between moral philosophers from that point on. But yeah, and far as an international standpoint, they support Taiwan, support NATO, which in a lot of ways I think the Democrats are similar to that, but maybe not the NATO one. But I think that the one that thing they also support Israel, which is kind of debated between Democrats and Republicans a little bit, but they're big proponents of Israel. But when it comes down to supporting anything internationally, things evolve, things change. This should not be this should not be something that you stand firm on if a country is going way to the wayside. So that's just a continual assessment of your relations with the world. And also protecting veterans was another one. But yeah, so that's just a general overview of what the Republicans believe. I know this episode might be a little bit long, might be this isn't exactly a normal episode, but I've been just cranking out some of this stuff to be leading up to season 2. So as I said, I might not be posting anything for a few weeks now, and I will get back to you guys as soon as season 2 is ready to get launched. And trust me, I'm going to be putting a lot of time and effort into these, and so hopefully they come out really good. And I believe you guys will really like them. So keep tuned, keep in touch, follow me on social media for updates, Instagram, Twitter. But yeah, so thank you guys. Thank you for sticking with me. I really, really enjoy doing this. Keep sharing it with friends and family. And I'll see you in season 2. And it's going to be a blast. So does God exist? Let's ask the question. But yeah, so thank you, friends. And now, please, go out there and light the world.